Hello, everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today.
Oh.
That is right, because today we are concluding our buddy read of the First Law Trilogy with that can only mean the book called The Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie.
Well, Charles, it's been a pretty epic trilogy of buddy reads here, Charles, and I'm ready to dive right into the last argument of Kings. I should probably give a heads up to any listeners if this is your first time tuning into the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast for one of our buddy read discussion episodes. They are full of spoilers for the book that we are discussing in this particular episode, as well as the books that come before in the series. So if you've yet to read the full First Law Trilogy up through the last argument of Kings, then now is a good time to, first off, to go to wherever you need to go to buy this wonderful series because it is amazing.
Yes.
And second, it's a great time to turn this down in your headphones and save this for later until you've gotten through Joe Abercrombie's incredible series.
Well said, Dylan. You know, I'm so relieved now that the spoiler warnings are off and we can talk about this series in its entirety. I think the First Law Trilogy has to have one of the records for most spoilers we've had to go back and edit out from our conversations. Simple things like title slips or hinting at character relationships or like just mentioning a character's in a certain place at a certain time. It's like, oh my God, like so much about what makes the series great is how all these characters end up at the end of Last Argument of Kings, and we're trying to say how clever it was that what's happening here, how it plays out in the ending, and we couldn't have those conversations. We kept tripping over ourselves, and now it's just like finally we can talk about Baez, we can talk about Glocto, we can talk about everybody from start to finish. It's so relieving.
Right. I think there was one point in one of our episodes where I said a character's name and I wasn't supposed to, and you had to edit out probably me saying it twice in a row. So, Charles, you're doing awesome work behind the scenes there, the dachshund of our podcast, as we like to say, editing out all of my mistakes. And, Charles, like you were saying, there's no one that we're more excited to talk about with the training wheels off, if you will, than Baez, first of the Magi, and some would say first of the moneylenders.
Some would say, like Archlector Glocta.
Yes, so you can say that title now.
Or we could say Superior Glocta.
We can say whatever we want.
We could say whatever we want, yes. And,
I can't.
You've read a little bit further ahead. I've only read one of the standalones, which doesn't really spoil anything for this trilogy, so I feel pretty safe. But yeah, Dylan's read all of the books that take place in the First Law universe, so he might have some knowledge that the rest of us don't have. But hey, you know what?
Share.
He's not going to share. He's gonna be good about it, and let's just flip and get into it, man. There's a lot to cover here. But the series starts off strong. Now, the book starts off strong. Last Argument of Kings, which comes from King Louis the something, that
14th, I believe.
14th. Good on you. Thank you. That it's what was inscribed on all of his cannons. That's the Last Argument of Kings is war. So that is what kicks us off in the series. And we start with, in the plot, electing a king. Glocta is campaigning for votes on behalf of Salt, Archlector Salt, and they're competing for votes against High Justice Morovia. You have this sense of like, you get a little bit of this subverting or this little sarcasm that Abercrombie has of like, it's a democracy, but of course you buy the votes. Like, that's how voting works. So you get a taste of that right away in these moments, which it's, and through Glocta, who already like is disenchanted from everything possible about life, is like, well, of course, and that's just what I'm doing right now. I'm trying to bribe people so that we can elect a puppet king.
Right. Well, like we said, Charles, I think Glocta is the one whose just internal monologue and way of seeing things most aligns with just the kind of book he's in. Like,
Yes.
He's got a very grimdark way
Yes.
of seeing the world, and he's super pessimistic, but it's also realistic in the world of Joe Abercrombie, and we all know you have to be realistic about these things. So Glocta, there's legitimately a point, this is well after in the plot point we're talking about right now, but we're fair game here. So yeah, he legitimately is ready to die and then is spared and is like, oh, I was ready to die and then I don't. Like, maybe the key to not dying is to like be just cool with it and even want it. And that's a very I think self-aware move for a character in the First Law series. He's super cynical, Charles.
And speaking of self-aware, we have the exact opposite of that in Jazal.
He's gotten better, though.
He gets better, but at the wrong times and the wrong ways. It's so funny.
That's well said.
But so the king is now dead, a bit ahead of schedule, and everyone's trying to vote on who's going to be king. And we all know from reading the series that it is not Brock who was the perceived front runner. Oh no, Baez in the 11th hour convinces the open council to elect Jazal with stories of his heroic deeds that we all saw, and claims Jazal is the illegitimate son of King Guslav. So it's like he went off into the edge of the world and fought off this on the bridge and all these other things like.
Oh right, yeah.
And Jazal's just like, I deserve this.
Well, it's interesting because at first he doesn't feel like he deserves it, but I think one of Abercrombie's almost theses in the First Law, maybe the main one of the main things he's trying to get across, is that if you go back to similar circumstances, then all these character developments, all these changes you've gone through and stuff like that will eventually revert. It's like if you are capable, this is a big thing I think that Joe Abercrombie subverts, is he has its characters go through all of this character development where just as much as any other series, I would say. And then what he does is then peel it back and say, well, if you can change in these maybe good ways, like I think Jazal was doing, then you can also change again and change back when you're back in these more typical circumstances. And Jazal, I think, maintains a lot of what he's changed with. Like, he's trying to be a good king when he gets into the role, but he definitely starts to change back to those more narcissistic tendencies as soon as even before he's king, even just when he's returning to the Agron from quelling rebellions and stuff like that he didn't really earn. Right. So yeah, he's pretty quick back to
it's so funny. He comes back like from that adventure to the end of the world that we all read in Before They're Hanged, and he's like, leave violence to other people, powers like just get you in all kinds of trouble. I just want to be with Artie. And then the minute they're like, we're promoting you, he's like, oh, Yeah, and like they put like the new title on him and they give him a new job. They put the robes on him, the crown on him, and he just immediately, you watch him revert back right away. He almost forgets about Artie completely, and he's like literally outside the front door of having just like been with her. And then they're like, "We're gonna promote you and send you off on a quest." He's like, "Oh, cool." Like, finally, this is awesome. I've just been promoted. How great is this? It's like, did you not forget all that stuff Logan was teaching you like right before this? Like, you're with Artie right now. You've got it made. So
Yes and no. I don't know. I think I see Giselle as a little bit more resistant at first, like more reluctant to jump into these things than he eventually he falls into it. But I think he's trying at first to stick to some of these lessons, and he kind of goes through these rationalizations similar to, it's almost like that it makes sense that Logan influenced him to do all these things, but that the lessons didn't quite stick, and he ends up reverting back to his own ways when old ways when put in similar circumstances, because that's kind of Logan's thing too in this book.
that's true. But for me, like, what I love about Jazal is those moments where he does those character growth kind of things or is tempted. That almost becomes like the joke. Like Abercrombie's telling, it's kind of like, I laugh at some of these moments, right? Where it's like, you're just imagining all these people around him. He's like, "You're being promoted. We're sending you on a mission." He's like, "What?" And it's like, "Here's your title. Go, go, go." And then he's like, "Yeah, of course." Like he talks himself into it, and it's almost
He does
funny.
talk himself into it.
It's funny to watch that because he's literally like, just talking about, bought in his head, like, this is the new me, like, I'm gonna make it work, and then it immediately gets swept under the rug, like juxtaposed right with that scene of him getting promoted. And that happens quite a bit. Like, he decides he's gonna be a good king, and that, like, at like the most inconvenient times, and his ideas are super inconvenient to Baez and the closed council, and it's just funny to watch him go and ultimately like accomplish nothing. So
Yeah.
it's to me, it's like he does the right things at the inopportune times, and he gives in at temptations, and we still see him in this book as like a more of a good guy, but he's like,
By the end, anyway.
by the end, but he's like playing this game that he has no idea what's going on. Like, he's working at his level, but he's like way too many levels removed, and it couldn't be more clueless. Even towards the end, he's just like, I'm just resigning myself now to this because I can't. Like, I don't get it.
Right. Well, the only thing he really understands by the end is not to mess with Baez and to listen to Glocta, because otherwise he'd be messing with Baez. Yeah. And for a king, that's exactly the lesson that Baez wants him to learn, and exactly. He really doesn't need him to know anything else. In fact, anything else is arguably a hindrance.
Yeah, that's
Baez.
The whole reason Baez lifted him up in the first place.
Right.
So, but we will get into that. I love that scene where Baez kind of daddies up on Giselle, but we have so much more to get through.
Can I say one more thing on Giselle?
Of course.
Charles. I think that, you're saying it's funny, and it is funny. Like, I do think Giselle, these like moments where he fails upward, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the Giselle storyline. And he ends up king, he ends up kind of this puppet. And I guess there are a lot of funny moments there, but after a few reads, Charles, at this point, my dominant emotion around Giselle's arc is just like sadness. Like, I feel really sad for this guy who ends up getting everything that he thought he wanted, really, and then is miserable in that situation. It's actually super sad.
I mean, where he ends up is quite tragic. He ends up like totally isolated and alone, and ironically, he's one of the most powerless people there is, and he's the king. And that, I think, is like the cruel joke that is like that cuts in here. There is this like bitter irony to poor Giselle and his story arc, is that Abercrombie's like, here's the most like ineffective, powerless person, and he's the king of the Union, and because he's the puppet for Baez, and he had to give up Artie to be with the queen, but the queen doesn't love him at all. And like, these kinds of things are very tragic. It ends up isolating, like, oh, Giselle learns his lessons, but he's like he's in a position where he can't do anything about it. He's like, the
Right.
people should have a democracy. We should build hospitals. We should feed the
You're
hungry.
right.
And like those are breakthrough moments for someone in the first book, was just admiring his chin all the time.
Right.
But it's like, it doesn't matter. Like, who cares? Because he can't. Because Baez is like, that's a horrible idea.
Yeah, that's super well said, Charles. I think you hit the nail on the head with Giselle and the tragic irony of being this powerless person as king. And there's even reflections from Giselle where he's like, "Oh, when I was captain, Luther, I was able to wake up when I want. I could have been with Artie if I really wanted to. The only thing that was getting in the way was my own
Yeah.
ego and being caught up on nonsense. And now that I'm king, Giselle Dan Luther,
And now that he solved his
I
ego
can't
problem
do any
too.
of the things I want to. I can't. I spend all day doing what other people want me to do, and I'm married to someone who other people want me to be married to,
Yeah.
and that's
His like character
It's
traits did
super
a
tragic.
reverse. He went from low standing, obnoxious to like kind of a chill guy, high standing. He did the flip, and just by the nature of still being at those opposites, he can't really get what he wants. So it's kind of funny to.
Yeah.
It's funny, but it's also sad, like you said. He definitely has one of the more sad arcs. He's being used by everybody, and no one likes him. So it's like a really sad thing. Speaking of potentially sad arcs here, we have to go to the north. We have to do the Bethod arc now.
Bethod. All right. Well, shall we get into it, Charles?
Yeah, we've got our good old Logan Nine Fingers heading back to settle some scores with Bethod. And, we get this really we get this moment of like, finally, where Logan is reunited with Dogman and the crew, because we've known that they're both alive this whole time, but they both thought each other were just dead, if that makes sense. So it's like, oh, finally they're meeting up, and it's like, hallelujah, the best friends are back together.
That is an epic moment, Charles. Can I back us up just a bit, though, actually, now that I'm thinking about it? Pharaoh doesn't get the credit ever, and I don't want to shy away from just speaking about the moment where Logan and Pharaoh basically have a chance to put it aside and put aside any differences and actually stay together when they land at the docks. Because they're at Adua and they are actually given this sort of last conversation that goes pretty brief. And I think that's the first of many steps for Logan toward becoming the Bloody Nine again.
Right. And Abercrombie, that was an interesting moment where they're all kind of breaking off at once they get back to the Union. And there were so many times, both in Logan's perspective and Pharaoh's, where they both acknowledged that they want to say something, but then the timing was never right. It was always kind of awkward, or they were expecting the other person to say something and they just said something, or they said something that they didn't mean. They were just kind of socially awkward and confused, and that caused them to clam up. So it's like that continually happened, and there could maybe be a parallel universe in which the setting made it so that they clicked and said the right thing at the right time. It just never did. It was just a series of blunders that, Pharaoh ended up being too proud to turn back, and Logan also like didn't think it was going to happen, and they parted ways. And that is a good moment to bring up, because it is kind of like this like what if of like he could have there's no reason that he needed to go back and fight Bethod, and if he had listened to his own advice, he would avoid violence at all costs. But he's got kind of this like, martyr kind of syndrome of like, well, I'm good at killing and that's all I can do, and I'm going to keep doing it even though I tell everyone else to leave it to the people dumb enough to do it, and I'm the one that I'm not dumb.
Right. That's well said, Charles. And we get that throughout from Logan, is these rationalizations that he's able to keep telling himself how you have to be realistic about these things. I've already done this, and now I might as well do that. And this sets off a chain of events that bring him back to where he ends up being, by the end of this whole thing, way more like the kind of person we kept hearing he was in the past. And he does have reflections like, oh, I should have just stayed with Pharaoh, but I couldn't because blah, blah, blah. And it's always like, yeah, but also you could. And here he could. But instead, we end up with, well, I got nothing left but scores, so I might as well settle them, which is another just false.
Yeah.
Like,
It's like,
like
dude,
no.
what? They could try and do anything else.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have to be Pharaoh. You could go anywhere else and
Yeah.
try anything else,
And
but
one of the
he
things I
doesn't.
would say is like I don't know if Pharaoh and Logan could ever make it, even if all
Sure.
the stars were aligned anyway. And we know they don't towards the end, but that could be for a whole other reason. But at least for now, it's like they weren't that solid of a relationship when they spent all that time together anyway. I just don't think Logan is capable of it. I don't think Pharaoh's capable of it either. You know, they're two people who are so um, dug into their one way of life that there's no going back for either of them. It's like they're almost kind of self martyrs in a way.
You make good points there, Charles, and I think that, yeah, the same part of Logan and Pharaoh that brings them both back through arcs that make them ba- both focused on vengeance in the end, which is probably completely unsurprising for Pharaoh. It's her favorite word is vengeance.
Yeah.
But Logan, I think we were led to believe in some ways maybe was on this redemption arc, and then he has those qualities that you were bringing up that had him going back to settle these scores and moving away from Pharaoh, and maybe it never would have worked out with them. But yeah, there's this alternative idea of like if Logan was different and able to listen to his own advice a bit, it didn't even have to be with Pharaoh, even if that wouldn't have worked out. It could just be, like you were saying, Charles, literally do anything else
Yes.
except for go settle scores.
Yes.
It's like that.
He can't
Yes.
learn his philosophies versus his rationalizations. You know, it's like once he turns that perspective on himself, it just completely falls apart. And I guess that just has to do with his image of himself. You know, it's kind of self-deprecating in a way, and like he's almost doing it as like it's what I deserve. It's all I know how to do. You know, so it is tragic in ways, and that, but it does bring him to reunite with Dogman and crew.
Yes.
Which was one of those like finally moments that we got in the beginning of the story that I was like, yay, everyone's together.
Right. I mean, the story of the First Law starts with Logan getting separated from this crew. And it is an epic moment when he meets up with them again. And as always, just the way that each individual character reacts to Logan tells you so much about Logan, tells you so much about them. And the way he interacts with the Dogman is kind of, they have such a history that they basically just clasp hands and it's like, enough said. I
Yeah,
mean,
and
these
it's
two
like,
have been through it
where's
all.
3 trees? Back to the mud. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, most of you, pretty good. I thought you were all dead until recently. Then there's the great moments with, we might be going skipping in a little bit, but I loved when they all were talking about Shivers. He's like, oh, he's so-and-so's son. He's like, but he's dead too. It's like, no, the other son.
Rattlesnake's son.
Yeah, Rattlesnake's son, but he's dead too. It's like, no, the younger one. He's like, he's just a boy. It's like, count the winters. You know, like they have that
Yes.
conversation with everyone individually where it's like, what? But he's dead. It's like, no, the younger one. Yeah, you know, it was so great to see like they do have this history and they do have this companionship and this friendship that, you know, can't be replaced. It's just like a lot of like the North to me feels so like lived in and so, you know, they're so funny the way they experience life. It's just like so great.
And I meant to say Rattleneck's son, by the way.
Rattleneck, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, Shivers, Rattleneck's son, not that one, the other one.
Count the Winters.
Not just a boy. Yeah, that Count the Winters. Not just a boy anymore. He's a very tall man with long hair, and he's ready to fight. He's a very strong fighter. We learn pretty early on, and Shivers is one of my favorite characters in the First Law universe. So I think I'm excited to get into him a little bit more. There'll be some cool moments with Shivers where he chooses a little bit of a different path than the one Logan seems to be on. So
Yep.
we
Gotta
get these cool moments. It's awesome to see the gang back together.
Yep, yep. And speaking of like fun side characters from the north, we have the eccentric hillman Crummocky Fail, who he forces himself into the like war party with Dogman and Logan, and they concoct this like last stand kind of scheme in the high places where it's like, let's put all of us together, all these men that Bethod hates more than anyone else in the world, go into this fortress and wall ourselves off, and he'll take the bait. He couldn't resist such a prize, and then we'll have the Union come in and sweep him out. That was the plan. And
Well, it makes a lot of sense, Charles. I'm sure Crummock has a great fortress ready for something like that, right?
for sure, and Logan's loved by the moon, and
Those interactions are so good, Charles. Like there's a moment where Crummock is obsessed with Logan. Like saw him in I think it was when he fought Shama Heartless. Crummock saw Logan basically brutally kill this other incredible named man in a duel, and since then has been just like obsessed with Logan. And when Logan shows up, Crummock like gets down and like hugs Logan around the knees like
beloved of the moon.
yeah, and he's always telling him how beloved of the moon he is, and it's very interesting. And that's something Abercrombie does so well, is just how he establishes these side characters and their voices so
yeah, and what's
well.
interesting about Crummocky Fail is like, is he wise or is he crazy? And like, if you listen to him enough, he starts to make sense, and then like the plan starts to unfold, and you're like, oh, this guy is just an insane person. You're like, great, we'll like wall up in his fortress, right? Because Bethod's been trying to kill him for years and hasn't succeeded. And then you get there, and it's a non-existent fortress. They had to build the walls themselves, and Crummocky Fail's
Right.
like, oh yeah, well, we'll do that. It's like, the important thing is we're here and the moon shines on you, and that's the important thing. And you're like, is there anything to that? Like, we know Logan goes a little crazy, but it's never explored. So it's like this, is he wise or is he crazy trope that's kind of put through Crummocky Fail.
Right.
He has all his kids that can barely hold his weapons, that he has fight with him and carry his stuff.
Yeah, little Isser and Efel out there with the what was it, the spear that she was carrying, or something anyway.
It was like
an
axe.
They were having an axe, so they were having some trouble carrying that around. But yeah, Crummock takes them over there. They're also depending on the Union to get it together and to actually basically bring up the flank once they've trapped Bethod there. But we're dealing with typical Union nonsense when Lord Marshal Burr passes away.
He finally dies. It's like, oh, he survived. Like, when he walked out of the tent, I was like genuinely surprised. Like, I thought he was dead. And that fun twist in Before They're Hanged is so good. And then they have that touching moment in this book where he's like, you did the right thing. Like, I'm proud of you. We're the only ones that kind of understand, and there's a lot you have to do as a leader. Like, he kind of gives him that, father figure moment, which we realize now is a passing the torch moment, because poor old Marshal Burr passes in his sleep, and with the king also dead, there's basically just a standstill with the Union troops. They're just like, we're not doing anything until we figure out what's going on. Where it's like, are you kidding me? We have to go kill Bethod. That's why we're here. It's like, no. We have to figure out who's going to be in charge. So that was like a funny little twist in development there. It's just like the power of bureaucracy.
And Polder and Croy are classic generals from the Union who just cancel each other out here, basically. And it ends up in a situation by just a twist of fate that Giselle, now king, just is drunk during a council meeting and starts saying that he wants West to be the Lord Marshal.
Yes, he
And
insists it. He's like, "I am the king," and he
right.
hits one of them in the head with this
He
cup.
throws his goblet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which Bias
And
approves
Bias
of.
is all about it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, Bias thought an occasional temper tantrum from the king renders them feared enough, but not to the point where if you're throwing them all the time, then everyone thinks you're out
right.
of it.
This one he was on board with, but he gets progressively less and less enthusiastic about
Yes.
Jazal standing up for himself as time goes on. But in this moment, it ended up bringing a semi-swift conclusion to this whole who's the new Lord Marshal. West does this really brilliant strategy to keep Polder and Croy in line. He tells them the same thing. He's just like pitting them against each other, basically. Like, oh, I'm colluding with your rival, and you better not slip up. And so they both think that they're falling out of grace and need to impress Lord Marshal or get fired.
Exactly. He tells them that the only thing he could disagree with when talking to the other general was the matter of the general that he's currently talking to. So he's like, Croy, the only thing me and Polder disagreed on was the matter of you.
Yeah.
And Croy, I said we got to give you a chance, but at the slightest error, I'm sending this letter to my friend, the king, to have you dismissed. And he trusts in the fact that these two will not converse with each other, so they will not get
compare
on the
notes.
same page. Yeah, they're not gonna be like, wait, he told me this, he told me that. Like these
and the
two.
note he was threatening him with wasn't real. It was very much a nice move of scheming on Wes's part.
Pike was proud of him.
Pike was proud. Pike was impressed.
Yeah.
And when you impress someone like Pike, that you're really in the thick of it. You're being real deceptive and sneaky. So that ends up working, and in the 11th hour, the Union arrives, drives out Bethod from the high places. Fast forward, we're in Carleon. Carleon.
But Charles, we should talk about when Logan goes bloody 9 and kills Tolduru Thunderhead, as well as one of Crummocky Fell's poor kids. I mean, we get this situation. We've heard so much about, I'm the Bloody 9, I transform, and then you see it happen, and every time he's like, I should kill one of my friends, but first I'm going to kill all the enemies.
Right,
but then I'll get to my friend.
Pharaoh, he almost killed,
right.
I don't know if he's killed Dogman at this point yet or not, but there may have been
he
one.
Doesn't kill Dogman.
Well, he tries to. I know he tries to at
the
end, but I think he also thinks about it earlier on. I can't remember. But yeah, we've seen this a bunch of times where we know that the Bloody Nine's kind of indiscriminate about who he kills, and sometimes that voice in the back of his head pulls back a little bit. But in this case, do a total 180 where Tolduru Thunderhead is like, "Are you okay, Logan?" And then dagger to the neck right away. And he's like, to touch the Bloody Nine is to touch death. It's like, dang, son, that was cold.
Yeah, and cold is exactly what Logan feels when the Bloody Nine is taking over, so it's appropriate. I think it's a good fulfillment of a promise with the Bloody Nine here, which is that the Bloody Nine isn't just there to come in at the 11th hour, like you were saying earlier, Charles. Right. It's not just this thing that saves Logan. It's a thing that's killed people Logan cares about in the past and is apt to do it again. And Abercrombie kept kind of teasing it, and finally this moment with Tolduru, and the sun is pretty messed up too, shows us no, the Bloody Nine will do things like this. And I'll also say, Charles, it was interesting seeing Tolduru gets a lot more time in the spotlight right before all of this. I guess when maybe you saw this since this is your second read too, Charles, I was very able to see how we get all these heart-to-heart moments all of a sudden with
Yeah.
Tolduru and Logan, like right before Tolduru dies, which is good
Yeah.
play by Abercrombie to tell us how nice a guy. There's only like a moment where Logan reflects on like Tolduru, like that's a good man, like what a nice guy, and yeah, that's what happens to the nice guys in First Law novel.
That's true. And I like what you said about like paying off on these negative aspects of the Bloody Nine, because it has kind of been this thing that's saved him more often than not. It's like when you need to do some incredible feat of violence, there's the Bloody Nine to help you through, and it's kind of badass. But we've known through the dialogue that Logan is haunted by the Bloody Nine, and that we know that it's his scores that have kept him in blood for so long, and he's haunted by that, and he's not proud of it by any means. But we're like, well, it gets you out of all these pinches. But then we finally see in this 180 this 180 act of murder of his friend who was just trying to help him, really speaks to like how big of a problem the Bloody Nine is and how disassociated the two really are.
Well said, Charles. Yeah, and I think it parallels what Logan's arc is doing too. That's what's so masterfully executed by Abercrombie here is he's been telling us over and over Logan has a really dark past and he's a messed up guy. The Bloody Nine is even worse here. And we've also been able to kind of rationalize ourselves as readers that, oh yeah, but I mean all that's backstory and he keeps doing all these like good things now in the current story. He's redeeming himself, and it's almost enabled, I'll say, by the fact that the Bloody Nine, even when that happens, just like kills Shanka and stuff. Like not doesn't do anything that terrible for the most part, like killing a friend. And then now that Logan's kind of back on this path toward becoming the person who he was before the blade itself,
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing, oh yeah, like let's not forget the Bloody Nine is capable of these things, and honestly, we'll see. So maybe so is Logan.
Yeah, but you can't argue the fact that the Bloody Nine didn't come in handy in the epic battle of Logan versus
Oh yeah,
Fenris the Feared, a duel for the North in Carlion. You know, the North, the Union basically is called back to fight off the Gurkish, and they come up with this scheme with Bethod of like, you know what, if you can just stay here for 1 or 2 days while you mobilize the troops, we'll play you as a chip in this gamble of a trial by combat situation against Bethod. And Bethod accepts. He puts his champion, his Fenris the Feared, which has been so well built up to this point. We know that it doesn't
right.
take damage. We know that it killed 3 trees, and you know he's this huge hulking beast of a thing. And we get that moment with the spirits as well of like, he's been around for forever. He can't be hurt on that side, you know. And even Logan had learned some history about Fenris the Feared leading up to this. And the Bloody Nine has been built up so much he's never lost a battle, you know. He's just an expert at killing. And that all comes to a head. It's like two never defeated, hulking monsters of violence going against each other. It's really exciting.
This is my favorite moment in the
Mm.
First Law.
It is a
And
fantastic moment. What I've always liked about Abercrombie's fight scenes is he balances the power and the tension of power so well. He understands how strong his characters are and like builds them up. So by the time we get to this fight and we see Logan like getting crushed to death in a hug by the Feared, and we know that he's losing that power battle, we have an understanding of exactly how much power that is and like how
yes,
strong the Feared must be. And that makes that moment tense because we also know that he, you know, killed 3 trees and can't feel pain and has magical support behind him that the Bloody Nine doesn't. So this kind of mix of what we know, we don't know how this is going to play out, and we fully believe it could go in any direction at this point. You know, it's nearing the end of the series.
exactly, Charles. I mean, you said it so well when you described it as well built toward, basically, which is we've been establishing from that big epic fight with the Feared in before they're hanged,
Mm-hmm.
how strong the Feared is, Charles. And then, like you were saying about the Bloody Nine, that's so well built too. And then I think another thing that is adding to all of that is, even though, like we were talking about, the Bloody Nine has mostly gotten Logan out of tough situations,
Mm-hmm.
we also know that Logan does not like when the Bloody Nine is coming out.
Yes,
You
it's always like
know,
a oh
it's a
no,
oh
please
no.
no kind of thing.
And in this fight, in this moment,
Yes.
when we're seeing Logan being just destroyed by the Feared, we're like, the only thing that could possibly give him a chance here is if the Bloody Nine comes out, and then we start noticing the signs that the Bloody Nine is starting to come out, and even Logan now
It's
knows,
like,
like,
yes,
no,
finally.
this is a good thing. And I got legitimate chills from reading the line where it's like, so Logan's like, yes, yes, and then it's like Logan laughed and the Bloody Nine laughed together, and it's
Yeah.
like, oh my god, like this
Yeah.
epic moment of like the Bloody Nine's bad, 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 like you don't want this, and now it's like, but like the Bloody Nine's a terrible
This is an
villain, but
all-in
sometimes,
high
Charles,
stakes. Yeah.
yeah, sometimes a villain, a vicious killer, is exactly what we need, and in that moment it
The
was.
right
And
tool for the
how,
job.
yeah, and how Abercrombie is able to use that tool
Yeah.
is so incredible. And what a fight, just so well written and all that kind of
It's
stuff.
a really well written fight, and then going back to the balance, it's like what I love is that Logan, like the Bloody Nine, just didn't get so angry that he overpowered the Feared in his moment of anger and killed him. It's like there was a lot of stuff that had to play out that gave all of these little glimmers of hope, little edges that the Bloody Nine was able to finally overpower the Feared. Like the Feared is obviously stronger than the Bloody Nine, and
Yes.
like Abercrombie commits to that. You know, so many times in fantasy, it's just like, my will is strong and I'll smite you now. You know, it's like just overpowering through like, I learned a lesson as my character arc and now you're dead. But it's like, no, it's like, I got some insider knowledge here about, you know, your weak points going into the fight. And then we have Wes who does his little act of rebellion and
Yeah.
pulls the little strap off. You have Dogman, Grim, and Black Dow in the castle trying to fight the sorceress, which I love that scene too. And so it's like
great.
all of these moments are happening at the same time and we're rapidly going around them, and we see Logan losing. Even the Bloody Nine is starting to get overpowered, but it's all these little things and all that knowledge that he was able to get beforehand that tipped the scales. So it kept the pacing really good, it kept the threat really high, and yeah, the best fight scene in the whole trilogy for sure. It's a really great moment.
Well said, Charles. Yeah, everyone, all these amazing characters that, not all of them, but quite a few of them, I'll say, that Abercrombie has been building so well, play a role in this fight. You know, from West to Logan to obviously Feared's a great character, but then Dogman and Grim and Dow are doing their own part. So
where the sorceress catches them and is like, kill yourselves. Like, oh, okay, that's a great idea. You know, they're like under the spell, and then all of a sudden it's like record scratch 180, Black Dow, axe to the
who else,
face.
right?
Yeah. So good. That whole scene where it's like, you know, she's like holding all the cards, she's super powerful, but all it takes is an axe to the face. Splits her right in half, which was so funny and so good. And then that was like, Dogman's like, we have to wait for our chance to run, and Dow's like, forget that, and just starts running off. You know, so it's like you already could see like their dynamic, which we've totally understood at this point. So that's a total Black Dow moment, you know, of him running across, and it was just like, you know, super fun in that moment, and it kind of helped spread out the pacing of the fight with the Fear. And you know, just a really fun stretch of story going on.
Exactly, Charles. We didn't want to pick multiple characters for our side characters that stole the show episode that we released recently. We didn't want to pick multiple from Abercrombie's work because we could have filled a whole episode with these. But I think if we didn't go with Casca, I probably would have gone with Dow. Black
Yeah,
Dow is
Dow's
such
great.
an amazing side
Grimm is
character,
great too. I mean, I could talk for 20 minutes about Grimm, which is more than Grimm
which
has
is
ever
more than
spoken.
he
Yeah.
could talk about himself.
Yeah, because I think Grimm is such a well written character, and that might have to be a conversation for another day. But like, what a brilliant character he is for all kinds of reasons. We'll get more in that
Yeah.
later on. But for now, like Logan defeats the Feared, and there's this great moment that kind of wraps up this whole Bethod situation where literally still like in battle mode, Logan kind of walks his way up the castle and just obliterates Bethod. But as he's making his way up, Bethod like reveals all these moments like it's like, you think I wanted all this? You put me down this path to the point where there was no going back. It's like I wanted to like reach a deal with these people, and he just went ahead and killed them, and that started more rivalries and more, and I was left with no option but to conquer everything. And that's what's really interesting about Abercrombie's writing and about Logan, because in most fantasy stories, like the story would be over. It's like we beat Bethod, hooray! Like we beat the Feared, but it all gets kind of not stained, but it kind of leaves us a little ominous with this idea of like we were brought here ultimately by your bloodthirstiness. You left us no choice but to like take over everything. This was on you and your never-ending killing spree.
Yeah, and I think those are all very true of Abercrombie's writing, is that he's got this kind of you can't get this just hurrah victory moment where Logan kills Bethod and then we get to see him become king, which we do get to see, and it has to be kind of this like, first off, Logan, like, you might be a worse person than I am, and at least Bethod accuses him of being a way worse person than Bethod is. And then the rise to being the king moment is also like, oh no, please no, compared to in a lot of other fantasy novels where the rise to being the king after all this would be like, yes, like they did it. And the thing that has stuck out to me on this read, Charles, is it makes you wonder to what extent the way Bethod speaks here. Obviously, Logan has blood all over his hands, literally and figuratively, in this scene.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is like, is Bethod's like, it was all you, Logan, like you forced me into this, it wasn't my fault, just another double down from Abercrombie on like, everyone thinks that about themselves. And yeah, Bethod's a terrible dude too, but he sees himself the same way Logan does, which is like, oh no, I'm just a leaf on the water that got dragged into this. It's like, Bethod's this mastermind, but he's also like telling Logan, I had no control in this and it was all you.
Yeah, and I get a feeling it's a bit of both, because Bethod brings up some good points. He's like, I wanted to make peace with this person. You went and killed their whole family. So it's like, well,
yeah.
I can't make peace with them now. So you see that. But then he's also the one that brought on a sorceress and made deals with the Shenka and things like that, where it's like, okay, well, you're not redeemable by any means, but you do bring up great things about Logan's character, because Logan's a character that as a reader we really like. And it's like, Logan's king, like the main character that we really like is king. That should be like a fun moment. But you realize like Logan might not be the man for the job, because he's got nothing but rivalries, and he just makes more rivalries, and we see that like that's kind of the beginning of putting us in that mind space of like, hey, maybe this is Logan, like for real, like a guy that's killed so many people that he's got nothing but rivalries. And I think that's the beginning of Logan's arc for the rest of this book, which ultimately leads to him being kind of dethroned, I guess, by Black Dow. So it's just like this idea that how could he possibly have been king? He's like got too many scores and too many, rivalries, and he's held it all together through the fear of his own hulking presence. But you can't read a whole kingdom like that, and it's no surprise that it so rapidly fell apart for him.
That's true. And we've been seeing this throughout the Bethod arc, if you will, in the last argument of Kings, where A big chapter that stuck out to me is a chapter called Ghost. So if anyone wants to read through this part again, where there's all these moments where Logan is rationalizing his like why he makes all these decisions that set him back on the path toward becoming the Bloody Nine again. It's all these like, oh, like people ask me my name and like, well, I'm not a good liar, so I'm gonna say Logan Nine Fingers. And it's like, what kind of, and you're kind of in Logan's head and you still kind of believe in him back when he's doing that, or at least I did the first time around. And I'm like, oh yeah, like sure, why not? And then he's like getting into these situations where there's kind of a skirmish. He's like, well, I've killed like a couple of them. I can't leave now without killing the rest of them. And he does that assault on the. You remember this part, Charles, where he does he gets into a skirmish with some folks when he's with the Union troops. He gets his own little Union troops.
Yeah. Yes.
You're looking at me like funny.
Yeah, I'm just trying to like. Okay, I kind of remember that. Yeah.
So he gets into a skirmish and then he is like, oh well, I've killed a couple of them. I might as well go into their camp and kill the rest of them. Like, and it's all just complete BS, dude. It's like it's all just him saying things about how like, oh
well, it's like his whole decision to even go back north anyway and fight Bethod. It's total BS. It's him buying into this idea of himself and not having anything better to do, and also in part maybe in some ways he likes it, and that's all he's just attracted to fighting and violence, and that's what he wants to do, and he's trying to act like he's better than that, and he's not really. And I think that's something we start to realize with this final moment from Bethod. It's like, you think you're so great, but this is all on you, man. And you're like this is who you are for real. And if you don't realize that, then you're like truly clueless, in those moments. And, Logan's always trying to talk himself out of it.
I guess I just the point I was trying to make is like if you're just starting to realize this now, not to not to say anything mean to anyone who would be. I guess I'm just like the hints have been there all along.
Yeah, for
like,
sure.
It's not time to start thinking this. It's
you could also make those parallels of like, the North is always just known to be a little more direct and brutal and matter of fact and stuff. So like that kind of barbarian kind of nature of them. So you can kind of write some of it off as like, oh, it's kind of like barbarian influence coming out here. But yeah, Logan time and time again has always been in the thick of violence and has accepted on more violence than maybe he had to in any moment. And he's always shocked people with how violent he tends to go. And like those moments where he's making his way back north and hangs out with that Union crew is certainly an early moment. But I really think like Abercrombie's trying to have us position our brains a little more directly with like let's kind of restructure how we think about Logan for real. Like, I know we all like him and he's like he's like one of the better characters or whatever. He's the main character. We all love him, but how good is he really? And how much of this did he bring on himself and like all that kind of stuff? I thought it was a bunch of interesting questions being asked.
For sure. I guess I see this more as the nail in the coffin of that arc than the like beginning of it is kind of where I was trying to go.
Yeah, I guess for me the nail in the coffin's when Black Dow betrays him, It's just like, and Dogman like but falls out of grace with Logan too. Dogman's like, do whatever you want, Logan. I'm so over you right now. Like, like Dogman doesn't start to think that way until after Bethod. Like everything is starting to collapse for Logan now that Bethod's dead. It's like all the cracks start to show and it all comes tumbling down. And I feel like that was like the last nail in the coffin, like you said, for the inevitable just total collapse where Logan's right back to where he started in the water, jumping off of something.
The Dogman's that's a great point, Charles. Is I think when you lose the Dogman, that's when you're truly lost. So I guess that is the nail in the coffin. I am kind of, the Dow thing is like Black Dow betraying you obviously there's some great stuff where Dow we'll get there, but where Dow's kind of like you're worse than me, and
Yeah.
that's great too. But I guess uh, I I think even on my first read, I was all like, once this Bethod moment happens, I was like, oh, Logan is a terrible, terrible person, and
Right.
I was just waiting for the Dog Man and folks to catch up. I felt like
Yeah,
so.
yeah, that's pretty much what happens. I mean, he becomes a king, but it's already falling apart before he's even done anything. And then the decision to go to the Union was just another unpopular thing that he's done, and he's keeping everyone banded together through money and violence, and it's just not working.
Yeah, well said, Charles. But there's a lot more money and violence to be had when the
Mm,
Gurkish are laying siege to Adua,
that there
right?
is.
We're jumping into a lot of there's still intrigue going on at first in that
Mm-hmm.
storyline. There's all this, it's Glockta heavy, so intrigue is kind of to be
Par for the
expected. And
course, yeah.
even as the world is crumbling around them, basically, they are still trying. Like Morovia is still having issues with salt, and Glockta is trying to manage the fact that he's got these two masters trying to hold his leash in Salt and then Vount and Bulk,
Right.
who
So Salt
both.
basically wants Glokta to investigate Baez, and Valen and Balk want Glokta to investigate Salt. And so now he's between, I think it was called a rock and a high place, which was, a joke on all the stairs to Salt's office. But basically, he's like, man, I've just pitted myself against two incredibly powerful people, and I don't know what to do. And Artie had the idea of like, you need a third suitor, which he's like, you know what, that actually might work. And that's when he pleads his case to Justice Morovia. So literally, the Gurkish are laying siege to Adua right now, and Salt, Valendenbach, Justice Morovia, they're all couldn't care less about it. They are still working on their own scheming and political motivations, and Glock is just as involved in it. He recognizes the like humor of it, but he's like, but what can I do? Like, this is what I have to worry about right now. So it's interesting to see that all play out. The typical Union shenanigans that we're quite used to at this point. Morovia's like, well, somehow both Salt and Valiant and Bach know everything you're doing, so I can't help you until you get your house in order, which leads us to a really great Glockta moment here towards the end of the book. I love these moments of Glockta getting his house in order, so to speak.
But before he does, he has to confess, Charles. He has to. He gets this moment. It's very interesting where Glockta, who has been getting everyone else to confess everything, has been holding in all of these secrets himself. And when he
Yes.
goes to Morovia, where with this moment where Morovia tells him to get his house in order, he has to spill all the beans to his
Yes.
potential third master. It's really interesting hearing Glocta's internal monologues on like, oh wow, this is really refreshing to be the one, and he calls it confessing.
Yeah.
So classic Glocta stuff, and part of what makes him such a great character.
Yeah, even now when he's confessing all his secrets, he can't help but see like a humorous angle to it. He
Yes.
like is always removed himself from everything that's happening, and he's like, it's kind of interesting that now I'm confessing all of it and how good it feels, even though it pretty much means that I'm completely exposed and like all this work that I've done is now unraveling. And why do I feel so good about it? He still has those humorisms about him, and it's so interesting in these moments. Like you said, he's someone that gets people to confess all the time, and here he is confessing.
Well said, Charles. So we do start getting some epic moments like you were talking about when we have Glocta trying to get his house in order, and we start finding out that so Glocta's trying to say like who's the mole here? Is it Severard or is it Frost or who's telling on me? And of course, in classic Abercrombie fashion, both of them
Yes.
are betraying
And that was
Glocta
such a
just
fun
to
twist.
other masters.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was because like you buy in that one is obviously, spilling the beans. And I always suspected Severod, even back when he was like, yeah, I, bought this building and I rent it out. I'm like, okay, like here's someone who's, a little scheming, a little business savvy, like I got my eye on Severod looking out for his own self-interest, but Frost is like, you can't imagine Frost having a political alignment in any one direction or any like scheming or desire for like self-advancement or anything. Like, what would he spend money on? Like, you don't even know. Like, Frost just seems like a guy who likes to hurt people and is condemned to the shadows because he's albino, So it's like, what is the situation there? And you find out that another dagger in the heart is Frost too was spying on behalf of Salt.
Yeah, Charles. It's interesting too. This has always stuck out to me that Glocta asks Frost like why. Glocta's biggest thing is always he's usually ready to die if need be, but he wants to at least know why. He's always asking those questions. And he asks Frost, and Frost basically just shrugs.
Yeah.
And it's like, just as much as us, the readers are like, what do you, Frost, why would you even betray Glocta? What do you have in this? Frost doesn't even know.
Yeah, and Salt doesn't even treat Frost well. He calls him like a monster and all these other things and like an idiot and all this other stuff. And still, it happens. And it's such a great moment where Glocta, like his cane is revealed to be a weapon and he uses it to stab Frost. And Artie,
jab.
Jab, that's right. And Artie like hits him in the back of the head. It's like all these like funny things where and you're like, woo, that was like a great moment when
oh, definitely,
when Glocta rises to the occasion. Jab on Practical Frost.
Yeah, and that's some of the genius of Abercrombie's work is just these tiny things like that. Jab, Glocta.
Yep.
Jab.
And we're talking about power balance
it's-
as well. It's like it's still within Glocta's capabilities, even as someone who is as crippled as he is and damaged as he is. He's still like, if I catch him by surprise and stab him when he's not expecting it, I could beat someone like Frost. It's like, how does someone like Glocta beat someone like Practical Frost, who's been built up as this basically grunt, has like insane feats of strength? Like he's the one that breaks the doors down and like picks people up and just like captures them just by grabbing onto them, like how does Glocta take on that force, and you get the surprise Artie attack and you get the surprise jab.
And in the right situation, he did win a contest, so he could give him a jab, just like Marshal Varus always wanted.
Yes.
So we got that moment, and it's beautifully executed.
R.I.P. Varus.
R.I.P. Varus, R.I.P. to lots of folks, including Frost and Severard. So rough showing for those two, and it's interesting because the only person that Glocta can depend on, it seems, time after time, is the least dependable man anyone can think of in Nikimo Casca, who's out there to help with his crew of mercenaries.
That's right. The famed Soldier of Fortune makes an appearance in these moments. Like, we are mid-siege right now on Adua, or not Adua. Adua. Okay, good. So we're mid-siege, and Glocta is trying to take down the Archlector, and he recruits famed Soldier of Fortune Nikimo Casca and his mercenary grunts. And, they're navigating the sewers. That was another funny, payoff thing was with Brother Longfoot. They're like, who do we have that can navigate the sewers? And, of course, who was there? But Brother Longfoot himself.
It's one of his many talents,
One
Charles.
of his many talents. They navigate the sewers, and they get to the House of Questions, and then the university, and they discover that Salt is using the dark arts in an attempt to rival Baez. And we also discover that part of using the dark arts is they're eating Morovia, his third suitor.
Yeah, well, they find Morovia's body just scattered basically everywhere, and something clues Glokta into the fact that it is Morovia. And yeah, there's all this just chanting and demonic stuff going on. And Salt, I think Bias said he got a peek behind the curtain or got a glimpse of the puppeteer, and kind of he was the only one who really had a sense that Baez was the one pulling the strings the whole time.
Yeah.
And he was trying to take action. And I think there's no good guys here at the top, right? Like Salt is a terrible person. Baez is probably the worst of them all. Khalil doesn't seem so great either. So all these Salt was the only one though who was like anywhere near, not on their level, but like aware that level exists.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because in my reread, I was like, I don't think I've given Salt enough credit. Like, if anyone of a commoner was going to take on Baez, like he was going down the right path, like he recognized the threat and he immediately adopted the strategy of learning this opposite power. So I'm like, you gotta give Archlector kudos for that. He maybe is not the most likable guy for being so cold and, like kind of dismissive and, a bit intolerant and all that stuff, but he does.
Quite intolerant.
He does.
He treats Glokta really terribly.
He treats Glokta terribly. He says, nasty things about all kinds of people, but he's always making the right moves and he's accepting of reality and he's adjusting and he always knew the next step. It's just he was not expecting Glokta to maneuver his way into the fray. And that with the power of Nikimo, Casca, and crew, they're able to, stop the proceedings and stop the rituals and put Archlector Salt into custody.
Yeah, and we get this epic moment where Glokta gets to make the arrest of Archlector Salt after all this time. And we got some Salt, you could tell, was, I guess, seeing he was on a time crunch and the pressure and all this kind of stuff was getting to him, where he was lashing out even more in this book, like treating Glokta even worse and all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And you can see, I feel like Abercrombie was using those moments to make sure that this arrest of Salt gets to feel like a big moment for Glokta, where Glokta's a bad person and we see a lot more of him being various degrees of good and bad. Like Glokta does some of the worst things anyone does in the entire series, and he also does some of the most selfless things in the series that can only cause pain for him, and often does. So it's interesting to
Why
see,
does he do any of it, Dylan?
That's a great question, Charles.
But yes, he does. And I think also at this point, Glokta's strategy started to reveal itself, and Archlector Salt already knew that Glokta was compromised since he was taking money from Valentin Balk. So I think that's a combination of things, right? Like Gurkish are at the door, he has Salt has to make moves because he recognizes the threat of Baez as well as the Gurkish, and he's kind of gotten Glokta's number and is like, okay, well, Glokta's obviously compromised now, and he started to withhold information from him and bring on more people and all these other things. So it all comes to a head now with this arrest, which brings us to the next segment here, which I called, I don't know if you noticed, making a magi.
Yeah. No, I think you nailed that, Charles. I saw that in the notes and I was like, nice.
All right, everyone, that's going to be it for today. We just had so much fun talking about the last argument of kings that the conversation went on for over 2 hours. So we split the episodes in half. And I know just when we were started to talk about Baez, don't worry though, there's more Baez, more making a magi, as I called it, hilariously just there. And we're going to get into depth to every ending for every POV character. You're not going to want to miss it in part 2 coming out on Wednesday. If you like what you heard, you know what to do. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're on all of those platforms. Send us an email at theftfpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to show some love, all you Apple fans, reach out to us. Give us 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts. Toss 5 stars to your podcasts, guys. We really appreciate it. But you know what? Just by getting to the end, just by listening, we appreciate it so, so, so much. So thank you all for listening. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.